Hello, welcome. You guys are on a roll. You're doing a great job. We're now on to Chapter 13, discussing disability discrimination in the workplace. This topic includes recruitment, interviewing of candidates, dealing with individuals as they become employees and they're already working for our organization, and also as they're separating from us. We want to make sure that we are offering every opportunity for different employees to be able to complete the job to the best of their ability. And if that requires a little bit of an accommodation on our end, it's something that we need to look into and see if we have the resources available in order to make this a success for that employee. Things that we need to look at as you're going through the chapter. First, take a look at the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This is really the starting point for what came along later in the 90s. In 1990, the Americans with Disability Act, ADA. We've seen that everywhere. Restaurants, grocery stores, most likely in your office. You can see it at Simpson University if you're ever on site. This is what allows a building to be accessible for any worker or any patron that might come into their establishment. When we are thinking about Americans with Disability Act, the ADA of 1990, we want to make sure that we are making any kind of accommodations that we might be able to reasonably. That's what the law says. We should be able to make reasonable accommodations for our employees to be successful. So if we have an employee that comes to us and says, I would be much more productive, it would eliminate pain in my wrist per se if I had an ergonomic keyboard, would that be reasonable for us to accommodate with that? Absolutely, the law would say. If an employee came to us and said, I need a $10,000 reclining chair, that would help me do my job better. We're looking at a small mom and pop organization and it would be too much money to spend. That would not be considered a reasonable accommodation. Things we need to look at. That brings up the term of undue hardship. We want to make sure that we as the organization are not put into an undue hardship because of the reorganization, the ordering of supplies, whatever it might be, in order to reasonably accommodate that employee. But we have to keep in mind that the majority of our employees do have some type of disability, whether it's physical, it's mental, it's emotional. We want to really work with our employees to give them all of the tools that they need to be successful. They can actually be pretty widespread. You can have a teller at a bank that maybe could do their job with a reasonable accommodation of an interpreter. That sounds kind of intense, as that could be rather costly. You're paying for 2 employees to do the job of 1, but if that's something that's considered reasonable within the realm of the law, that's something we would want to do. You might also notice it if you've ever filled out an application or if you sat on the opposite end of the table. This is an element that we always want to include in our application, and that is the question of, can you complete this position with any type of reasonable accommodation? So you might have someone that's applying for the job to be a cashier, and they might not be able to stand more than 1 to 2 hours of time. A reasonable accommodation would be a stool or a 10 to 15 minute break. That's something that we could certainly do. So we don't want to pull anyone out of that applicant packet if they can complete the position with some type of reasonable accommodation. And keeping in mind that term undue hardship. We don't want to put any undue hardship on the organization itself. So what is a disability? As we're looking a little bit further into the chapter, disability defines a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more, that's the key element right there, one or more of the major life activities of an individual. Major life activity could be eating, walking, sleeping. That would be an example of one or more major life activity. And that goes on later in the chapter to describe a little bit further on what other elements there might be. Essential functions. We need to take a look at the position. What are essential functions of this job? We want to make sure that we are not meeting our employees' needs if it's something that we need to reasonably accommodate. If this is an essential function of their job, let's take that cashier again. If you need to be able to verbalize, this is your total, how can I help you, whatever that communication might be, that would be considered an essential function of the job. But Could you have someone that is potentially deaf or mute and still run a cash register? Absolutely. That's a tricky one. You might have found some other examples either in your workplace or as you're reading through the text here. We discussed reasonable accommodation again, and a further look at undue hardships for an organization. There are many different impairments out there. We want to make sure, again, the topic here is disability discrimination. So we never want to discriminate against an applicant, an employee, a customer, a patron of our organization because of their disability. We want to make sure that we have an open working environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. So keep reading. Make sure you do your burning question. You guys are doing great.